creatine, but I have received some funding, and I do serve on some boards and assist in some legal cases that are paid positions with creatine. I have received travel support as well. So the reason I put this up there is I'm only going to talk about evidence-based research. That's my MO. I only talk about what's been scientifically shown. And so that's just kind of a disclosure to make sure I'm not trying to sell anything or anything like that. Unfortunately, when we talk about the biological process of aging, it typically is a negative consequence or picture, so to speak. On the top left-hand side, you can see when you take a younger individual and age them over time, even with some activity, unfortunately, you experience significant muscle loss. That happens all throughout the body. But one of the new hallmarks of our research program, which we'll talk about today, does it matter with different sections of the body? Is the upper body more negatively affected than the lower body, or vice versa? On the far right-hand side, you can see, I'll try to use one of these little, the mouse here as a cursor. But on the left-hand side, you can see that there is an MRI basically picture of a cross-sectional area of the lower limb. And if you were to look at the quadricep area, the big femur bone, you can see that the density of the bone is very, very strong. It would take a sporting event, a car accident, or something very traumatic to actually break that bone at a younger age. The precious yellow tissue that you see around that is skeletal muscle. That's what we're always trying to achieve. Some ways to achieve that, obviously, are exercise, and can nutrition have some small or even potential larger beneficial effect. To everybody's demise, the red is subcutaneous fat. So even the leanest individual, including a runner, would have some type of subcutaneous fat around our muscle mass that stores fat-soluble vitamins. It actually acts as an energy source. If the individual will age successfully, and typically inactivity goes up with aging, unfortunately on the top right-hand side you will see the consequence of what we call the biological process of aging. The really dense femur bone substantially goes down by about 20 to 30%. So now all of a sudden, having a very difficult time to break a bone at a younger age, it becomes a lot easier as we get older. So if you know anybody who has fallen, maybe broken their hip, ankle, that's because the biological process or density of the bone has gone down. Just as important, the precious skeletal muscle in the yellow there does atrophy. There's things that are happening starting in the brain pathways that sort of change the chemical nature and structure of our skeletal muscle. And then unfortunately, as we can probably all attest to, as we get older, it's extremely easy to put on more fat tissue. The theory, though, is if the muscle is shrinking, that's one of the main ways that we decrease our metabolic rate. So what if we could sort of look more at the left-hand side? What if we exercise or maintain a physical activity lifestyle? Could we maintain more of the diagram on the left compared to the right? Okay, so this is the things we're trying to achieve for healthy and successful aging. If you go inside the bone on the bottom, you can see a young, healthy bone is more rigid, it's very strong. If you were to punch the wall, it's very difficult, hurt. Obviously, that's going to be a matrix of bone density. Unfortunately, if you know anybody with osteopenia or osteoporosis, the bone becomes spongier. Calcium salts and some of the matrix within the bone is jeopardized. And I'm super excited because towards the end of the class today, or the lecture, sorry, I show you some data that we did in collaboration with the University of Saskatchewan with a fancy piece of technology. We went inside the bone to see exactly what's happening. So again, this is sort of painting a picture of the etiology or some of the processes that do occur over time. From a health perspective, after the 4th decade, muscle and bone does decrease by 1 to 2%. This is a big moment. You want to build up the matrix as high as possible. Bone and muscle density should be built up at the younger years, and so therefore, once it starts decreasing, the rate of decline would be offset. These age-related reductions, which include muscle density, it's very rare to be shown, look at the density of the muscle, but it also includes bone geometry. The World Health Organization still considers bone mineral density as sort of the surrogate gold standard, but we now know there's other more advanced technologies that go into the geometry of the bone, also referred to as the architecture. Unfortunately, a decrease in both increase the risk of falls and fractures. Unfortunately, in Saskatchewan, we have the highest or one of the highest relative rates of falls and fractures in Canada, primarily in the winter months. So this is a really important application, not just for Canada, but specifically this province as well. Over the age of 50, 1 in 3 adults will experience a fall. This could have devastating effects. Sadly, a lot of individuals, as they get older, after the age of 60 or 70, experience multiple falls. At a young age, you can fall on the ice and probably bounce back up, but that same fall when you're 50 and above is very jeopardizing, can have some detrimental effects, resulting specifically in prolonged physical inactivity. The more inactive you are at an aging rate, you increase the risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and stroke, and therefore premature morbidity will substantially go up. Fracture of the hip alone in Canada almost costs $1 billion to the Canadian taxpayers. That's just fracture of the hip. Are there ways that we can increase bone density so when an older individual does fall outside in the winter, they can withstand the forces? So it's a huge public health concern. Independent of pharmacological interventions, we now think that the most effective strategy or intervention that a human can adopt is resistance training or weight training. It is now taken over as the #1 modality to do for overall health. It always used to be cardiovascular exercise. Resistance training has now surpassed aerobic exercise benefits in a number of categories. So if you told an individual what's the best thing they can do probably for their health when regarding cardiovascular exercise or weight training seems to have a small greater advantage. Obviously, you get benefits by doing both. This idea of becoming old, being inactive, take it easy, that's kind of what we've been saying for a long period of time, and indirectly we've been doing a huge disservice. In other words, we haven't really been lying, but we sure haven't been using evidence-based research to tackle some of these comorbidities. I'll give you an example. As we get older, my parents used to hear us saying, don't exercise, take it easy, you don't want to hurt yourself, you want to be cautious. And little did we know that maybe that's the time you need to increase the intensity or start to exercise. The vast majority of individuals, including over the age of 50, still say lack of time is the #1 barrier to exercise. Even retirees say they don't have time to exercise. So we got to kind of get new strategies or motivation to do that. I'm really happy to say that it's never too late. There's some centurions over the age of 100 that have started research or resistance training in Italy, and they're showing phenomenal improvements in balance and agility, as well as you can still increase muscle mass, albeit to a small degree, but that still has a number of health benefits. So again, is resistance training ever going to be found in a pill? We don't think so, but it can have some medical or health properties. And that leads us into the augmentation or the relationship between nutrition. It's well versed that dietary protein has beneficial effects. Good, healthy carbohydrates and fats can have beneficial effects as well. We're probably well versed on vitamins and minerals. But in the last 2 decades, there's been a lot of talk or interest in this metabolite called creatine. Creatine is just 3 amino acids that are produced in our body, and they sort of come together to form a potential energy source. The theory was that if our muscles have more energy, maybe that individual can do more work. They might have less recovery, increased recovery, less muscle soreness. These are some things that the theory was with it. So in the last 20 years, it's probably become the most researched anti-aging or older individual type of nutrient next to protein. It really is caught in fire based on some of the promising results. So what is it? A lot of people have heard it from the bodybuilding or athletic populations, but really it's a nitrogen-containing compound we naturally produce in our body. It's produced primarily in the kidneys and liver, and we're producing it all in a 24-hour period. About 66% is what they call considered phosphocreatine. So when you go back to high school biology or even some of our undergrad classes, you learn about how this molecule is really needed to maintain cellular energy. If you have more of this molecule in our muscles specifically, you have a greater chance to maintain energy during your exercise session, and therefore that could translate into benefits. The key, though, is I talk about exercise. Very minimal evidence suggests that you can take creatine without exercise and get some noticeable effects. It's not like an anabolic steroid or a pharmaceutical drug. It typically unleashes, or resistance training or exercise will unlock the magic of creatine more often than not. And I'll sort of paint a picture what that really means. But importantly, it is made in the human body through processes, through amino acids, which are the building blocks of your protein. You can get these amino acids in plant-based foods, of course, animal and dairy. And the process simply starts in our kidneys, and it ends primarily in the liver. And then this molecule called endogenous creatine typically will travel to our muscle, and therefore, if it gets in our muscle, you have more potential energy. So when you're in the weight room, on the soccer field, wherever it is, the individual may experience an increase in energy status to do more exercise or increase recovery. I will say there's new emerging research that creatine can get in the brain. So I would say the newest focus is on concussion treatment, Alzheimer's disease, dementia. We have a paper in review on memory and also sleep deprivation for students. We took students who were sleep deprived and we did a whole bunch of cognitive tests, and creatine actually improved their ability to remember. So that has massive implications for any neurodegenerative disease, and you'll see some big randomized control trials coming out with that as well. So again, although the premise today is supplementation, keep in mind you're naturally producing this in the body. That's why the Olympic Organizing Committee, nothing about creatine will ever be banned, because it's a natural product in the human body. Luckily for us, it's found readily in food. It's primarily in animal or flesh-based foods. So for example, seafood and red meat have the highest concentrations. So for example, if you wanted to get on the Y or the far right-hand side, 5 grams of creatine through cod, you could do it, but on a daily basis, you've got to consume almost 4 pounds of fish. If you like red meat, that's a lot. You're going to have to consume 3 pounds of steak. And where's milk? Well, you'd have to spend a lot of money consuming a lot of milk to get 5 grams. We naturally produce about 2 to 3 grams a day, but is there a reason these companies have come up with a commercial product? There must be a reason why. You can obviously see some of the limitations up here. What if you're a vegetarian? What if financially you can't afford to be consuming and buying all this high quality types of food? And a caveat is older individuals past the age of 50 typically have an ingestion of red meat that is low compared to younger individuals. So there's some things that are influencing the ability to get the amount of creatine. So do you need to supplement with creatine? I'll start right now 100% no, you do not. If you do not consume creatine from a supplement, that is totally fine. You're probably exercising, noticing tons of health benefits. But I'm just going to give you some evidence to suggest maybe if you increase, either through the diet, you might experience or expect a little bit greater benefits. So again, we synthesize and excrete in our urine about 2 to 3 grams a day, so there's a nice balance. Whatever foods you eat, plant-based proteins, animal or dairy-based, your kidneys and liver sort of repackage those in this metabolite called creatine. As I mentioned, it is highly influenced by your diet, red meat intake, and recently we see aging individuals have reduction in synthesis. But this is where it gets to the crux of the presentation. You can maintain normal health and exercise standards just by your endogenous synthesis and excretion. However, if you consume more, and as little as 3 additional grams per day, you get sufficient health benefits from a muscle perspective. That's primarily muscle mass and strength. The number one reason older individuals are placed in long-term care facilities is a reduction in strength. They can't live free and on their own. So this is kind of more of a healthy aging perspective. The gold standard is 5 grams. There's over 1,000 studies that have been done on creatine, and time after time after time, as little as 5 additional grams, in addition to what your body's naturally making, has been shown to have a plethora of muscle benefits. Increased muscle mass, strength, power, and endurance, and improvement in recovery. But always keep in mind how much food you would have to get 5 grams, right? Our recent area of interest is including bone density, massive implications for osteoporosis. We don't see any significant bone benefits with 5 grams a day. The minimal detected rate is when individuals took 8 grams a day. So what we're saying is you can live healthy and maintain status quo, but if you're trying to get an extra boost, you can definitely increase it through the food products. Is that feasible? Or that's probably why a lot of these companies have created a synthetic type of creatine called creatine supplementation. So I like to use this analogy. If you're not supplementing with an increase in diet or a commercial product, an omnivore, that's an individual who consumes animal, dairy, as well as plant-based proteins, they have about 120 to 140 grams of creatine in their muscle. Very effective. They can exercise, no problem. Vegans and vegetarians are at a compromised rate. So this is a really important subpopulation with the explosion of plant-based diets. They only have about 80 to 120 grams of creatine. Obviously, creatine is found in meat. They're not consuming meat. Each population is kind of working on 3/4 of a tank of gas. Creatine supplementation through diet or powder has the ability to top up the engine. You do increase your levels to the maximum rate that a human can store at about 160 to 180 grams. What does that mean? The individual has a greater capacity to use this metabolite during exercise to get greater benefits. The population of vegetarians and even individuals with low red meat consumption seem to experience the greatest benefits. 99% of synthetic supplements are vegan-based. There's no animal use whatsoever, so they are applicable for someone regarding the ethical use of animals. So I like to use this. You're simply just topping up your reserve a little tiny bit. Sadly, though, to get 5 grams of creatine, which has been shown time and time again to get significant health benefits, per day you would have to eat 4 salmon fillets. That's per day, 7 days a week. So there's a lot of issues with this. Works out to be about $20 a day. What if you're a vegetarian, vegan? You're emphasizing a plant-based diet. How are you going to do that? Red meat, to get about 5 grams of creatine a day, you would have to have 2 moderate-sized steaks. There's a lot of issues with cholesterol, different types of pesticides, things like that. There's another 20 grams. Again, what about individuals on a plant-based diet? Regarding the analogy of milk, you'd probably have to consume the entire cow from a milk-based perspective to get 5 grams. So again, it becomes a financial issue. It becomes an ethical issue. If you're vegan, plant-based, you don't like consuming animal products, there's a lot of issues. So the companies have come up with an alternative, if you will. It's no different than taking vitamin D supplements or calcium supplements or whatever it is. It's just an alternative or a different strategy. So more times than not, when you hear about the word creatine, a lot of people think of these jugs or powders, whichever you will, from a GNC or Walmart. You very readily see these. And one of the biggest advantages is that a tub of creatine, on average 1,000 grams, costs only $50. So if you only need about 5 extra grams per day, that's only going to cost you a nickel a day compared to $20 from food. Most, if not all, of these products are independently tested. They have the NSF safe label if it's just creatine. Sometimes you can get products that have a whole bunch of other things in there. You got to make sure that the product is independently tested. So all our research is focused on supplementation. It's very feasible, it's inexpensive, it's a lot cheaper than obviously cooking up a whole bunch of food. And luckily, it becomes a readable source. There's no taste to creatine. It dissolves fairly well. It's a little gritty. You can throw it in yogurt, put it in cereal, whichever you like. So this is kind of the focal point why a lot of individuals, especially aging individuals, when we ask, they suggest creatine supplementation is just really convenient. It's kind of like having a smoothie or a protein shake. It just becomes very convenient and financially cost effective. So what does our research tell us? Because right now I've been probably acting like, again, the used car salesman trying to sell you a product, which I'm not. I just want to give you the information. Well, we were fortunate to do the longest or biggest meta-analysis. So again, when people say meta-analysis are gold standard, no, RCTs are the gold standard because meta-analysis wouldn't exist if you didn't have all these studies. But the reason you do a collaborative effort from a meta-analysis is to increase statistical power. So you sort of lump all the studies that have been published on creatine in older adults all together. And luckily, in this case, we assessed over 700 individuals. So the more people you assess, you decrease the chance of statistical error or increase the probability that the findings are legitimate. So 22 randomized controlled trials were included. They had to be randomized to creatine monohydrate, so that's the creatine that we've been talking about, or placebo. And they had to perform resistance training at least 2 days a week, all the way up to an entire year. Some of the measures of body composition were diverse, X-ray machines, underwater weighing, and a bod pod, which is air displacement plasmography. So when we look at all the studies, and there's more to be added, on the right-hand side, you'll see that there's a little yellow arrow that says favors creatine. Please note that this was during a resistance training program. If there was no resistance training program in any of these studies, there's really good evidence to suggest this would not work at all. Please note, resistance training is the foundation. It has to be there. But for some reason, when you consume creatine during resistance training, compared to placebo, in other words, that's people who just did resistance training alone, there was a really significant increase in muscle mass. In other words, creatine augmented or extended the increase in muscle mass compared to just people who weight trained. That small metabolite, and the average dose was about 5 to 8 grams per day, really seemed to be effective, to the point it was almost 3.5 pounds of more muscle mass. To the young athlete, this is enormous. To the older individual, this is substantially important. The more lean tissue mass an older individual has, increased balance, increased productivity, functionality, and decreased potentially chronic disease. Skeletal muscle is the biggest area for glucose disposal, so there's some clinical trials in Brazil now looking at older adults with type 2 diabetes. So again, an older individual resistance training will get about 2 to 3 pounds of muscle mass. The addition of creatine may give them a couple pounds more. That could have potential beneficial effects or clinically significant effects. Just didn't stop there. When we look at measures of upper body strength, the individuals who consume creatine got stronger in the upper body. That might have application for improving activities of daily living, carrying groceries, shoveling the driveway. But I think what's even more important than upper body strength is this one. It showed also that you get an increase in lower body strength. And 4 other meta-analyses have been shown to support this as well. This is the area we're really focusing on older individuals because the largest muscles in the body are in the lower limbs. They go down successively with aging. That will limit the ability to perform activities of daily living. So overall, resistance training is the key. And creatine will just sort of augment these benefits a little tiny bit. But is that little tiny bit applicable for certain populations. I just wanted to highlight the difference between younger individuals and older individuals in here. And really, when I say 50 and above, the biological process of aging starts in the 4th decade. But after the age of 50, it really significantly starts to decline. So that's why exercise is so crucial. I think exercise is the anti-aging pill, so to speak. But when we look at muscle creatine levels in young and older individuals, this was quite interesting. There's no difference. What does that mean? Well, both age groups will respond positively to creatine. The theory is if one group had a lot, they'd only have a small capacity to grow. And luckily, we don't see, when we look at all these studies, any differences between young and older individuals. Therefore, as you get older, there's no reason you should not respond from a positive effect to exercise and or nutrition. Okay, so if someone says you're getting older, you may not need any nutrition or exercise, that's not what we're seeing. However, to those who don't like to do leg exercises, and we're notorious for it, when we isolated muscles specifically in the lower limb, and this is a really important take-home message, when we looked at studies that looked at the amount of creatine in the vastus lateralis, or the big muscle in the quadricep, this is the muscle that's primarily active with high-intensity exercise or movements. So resistance training, spin class, cycling, explosive movements, this muscle seems at an older age have reduced creatine stores. And one of the recurring themes that we keep seeing is older individuals really respond in the lower limbs with creatine supplementation. So we shouldn't be telling an older individual not to exercise, let alone not do leg exercises. We actually think they should focus more on the lower body because creatine stores are reduced, and therefore resistance training and or diet could really be beneficial. That will allow them to actually walk up the stairs instead of taking the elevator. That may allow them to do exercise that's really beneficial. So there is some evidence to suggest certain regions of the body are primarily activated. So we got to thinking, maybe the dose in an aging body compared to a younger body differs. The biological process of aging definitely influences certain things. What if that 5-gram threshold is not enough? And we were fortunate to publish this just this year. When we look at lower body strength, again, really important for functionality and the ability to live longer free of disease, in the low dose studies, that's 5 grams or less, it did not improve upper or lower body strength. There's something going on with the biological process of aging showing that only studies that use more than 5 grams in conjunction with weight training significantly improve lower body strength. So all these studies that have been previously published, primarily in younger individuals, 3 to 5 grams a day is plenty. But there's something that's happening as we get older that may be blunting that response. We may require more. How is an older individual going to eat 6 salmon fillets a day, 3 steaks? Supplementation can be something to be considered. Not necessary, but there can be some benefits. I won't bore you too much with this because it's a multifactorial process. You can spend all day looking at each type of protein or gene. But really, how does this work? Well, in combination with exercise, it's been shown to increase things that are anabolic. You may have heard of satellite cells. They're really involved in muscle hypertrophy or muscle damage. Glycogen and calcium, going back to high school biology, that could be a potential recovery agent. And then transcription factors are involved in protein synthesis. We think there's really good evidence it actually decreases catabolism or the breakdown of the muscle. It decreases protein breakdown, and the big area right now is inflammation. People with knee osteoarthritis are benefiting. Other individuals running a marathon, post-marathon, it's decreasing inflammation and oxidative stress. So it really seems to speed up the recovery, so to speak, of the body. So if you increase muscle anabolic properties and decrease catabolic, the net recovery could be beneficial. And I always like to finish talking about the emerging area on bone. It was discovered by accident. We didn't really think anything about creatine and resistance training on bone until we looked at some of our scans and noticed, geez, there's something there. Well, really basic. You have a continuous turnover of bone breakdown and synthesis. 24 hours a day, your bones are breaking down to stimulate calcium in the blood, and that simulates a whole bunch of cells to take that calcium and repackage it into stronger bone. In the presence of creatine, these cells on the bottom, osteoblasts, which build stronger bone, they use creatine for fuel. And if the bone cell is using creatine for fuel, they get more active, they replicate faster, they get more energetic. So the theory is that in the presence of creatine, the bone matrix may turn over quicker and get stronger. So that was a theory. That could have enormous application for something called osteoporosis, or potentially increasing the matrix of the bone. So about a few years ago, we did a randomized control trial that was done here and also at the University of Saskatchewan, and we had 32 postmenopausal females randomized to two groups, creatine. We base our creatine dosage on body mass. That equates the dose to everybody's size. So this was 0.1 gram per kilogram, which equated to about 8 grams a day. Again, it was in a supplementation form. The other half of the individuals got placebo. But a huge strength of the study was that it occurred for 52 weeks, 3 times a week, under supervision of qualified personal trainers. And to be honest, we were quite shocked with some of the results. We initially went into it looking at muscle, but the bone results almost were more clinically relevant. This is the change at the femoral neck. So if you consider your hip region, the region that individuals fall and fracture a hip, that leads to premature morbidity and inactivity. Ironically, if you look at the graph here, a full year of resistance training supervised and the addition of this metabolite creatine did not rescue. In other words, it did not have a positive effect above baseline. So the aging process can't or is overriding even exercise when it comes to bone density in postmenopausal females. But when you looked at the rate of loss, the group who took creatine had 3/4 or 3 times more preservation. So creatine sort of decreased the rate of loss or bone mineral loss at the hip compared to those on placebo. And that was significantly or clinically significant because it sort of attenuated or preserved the skeleton in a certain region that is prone for osteoporosis or hip fracture. So again, it was the first line of evidence to suggest there's something there with that interaction of exercise as well as creatine. And we think it was clinically significant. Again, I said almost $1 billion is spent annually on fracture of the hip, direct and indirect costs. So if we can preserve or increase the density of that area, that might be very important. So this is probably, this definitely will be my most prestigious publication. It's still in review, in press at Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise, but we think this one will have even more magnitude of effect. This is in both gender, male and female. We also did 1 year of supervised resistance training, and again, the dosage of creatine and placebo. But at the U of S, they have something, or a little bit better technology than I have in my lab. They use CT scans, it's formerly known as a CAT scan. That can go inside the bone, and it actually shows the difference between trabecular and cortical bone area and shaft. So they can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's a small amount of radiation that's given off, but it is substantially reduced compared to a typical CT scan if anybody's had one done at the hospital. So these are 3-dimensional images. The downfall is they only look at your limbs. You can't put a whole body in, so they're only looking at the limb. And since we started to notice the increase in lower body strength, you can look at the forearm muscles, but we said we really want to focus on the lower limbs. So the tibialis anterior, the calf muscle, those areas that are prone for falls and fractures. And ironically, the creatine group that did the whole body resistance training across both genders, they significantly increased muscle density. Muscle density is highly correlated with decreasing falls and fractures. The muscles in the lower limb got stronger. They were more dense. Huge implications from a falls preventative or fracture preventative strategy. And then the bone area. The distal tibia, again, looking at the shin bone, so to speak, creatine had a significant increase over time compared to there was no change actually, statistically with the placebo. Again, showing that creatine seems to work in conjunction with resistance training to increase the density of those bones. Why are they important? When you fall, you can typically fracture the tibia. So again, that has potential applications for functionality. And the distal tibia shaft area, which is highly correlated to falls and fractures. Creatine was maintaining the size, but the people on the placebo had a significant decrease, even with resistance training. So again, they're small changes, but they are preserving or having some beneficial effects. So this paper should be out in about a month at the Journal of the American College of Sports Medicine. So does it prevent falls? Well, we have this data. We're looking at it. We started this study in 2013. What year is it? It's still in the works. We have people exercise for 2 years, and then we measure them for a following year to see did the intervention decrease the risk or prevalence of falls. I don't have any data to show you, and then once it comes out, I'll try to update everybody. But we did do a meta-analysis on that very same question. Small number of studies have shown that the combination of exercise and creatine decrease the incidence of surrogates of falls. So it increases sit-to-stand or functionality tests. So that individual may have greater balance, coordination, and mobility. So there's a lot of potential avenues for future research. The area now is to look at different categories of aging, people with sarcopenia, osteoporosis. Cachexia is basically forced body mass loss, people with cancer, HIV. So we're sort of looking at all these clinical populations to see can it have some beneficial effects. For the students in here, this comes up all the time. There's a lot of myths about this product because it seems to have some anabolic properties. So I decided to put together a team and write a paper, a narrative review on, yeah, I know. It's correlation, right? You'll learn that in statistics. But put together a team and address all these properties. I would say the biggest one is creatine a steroid. No, it's something you're producing naturally in the body. It's just 3 Legos, if you will, or amino acids that come together in the kidneys and liver. It actually leads to water retention. Sometimes people take creatine and they say they put on a little bit of weight. That's just water retention, which is actually a good thing. So it doesn't lead to dehydration. I get this all the time, and the majority of my colleagues also suffer from this. There's only been one study ever. It was in rugby players, and when they took creatine, it increased a hormone called DHT, which has been linked to hair thinning and loss. It never led to hair loss. But of course, I can't stand up here and say there's 100% no truth to it. But I will say this was happening before I got into this area. But to now, it does not cause baldness. The big one is since it's made in the kidneys and liver, people think, oh, if you're going to take this in the diet or supplementation, it could really harm the kidneys and liver function. And there's no clinical evidence to suggest that as well. And the other thing, the increase in size that you typically may experience is muscle or water retention. We don't see any increase in fat mass. So there's a lot of people on social media. I love this cartoon. It's because when you read the science, it does refute a lot of the myths and misconceptions out there. So some take-home points. Creatine supplementation, either through an increase in the diet or through a product, can enhance the adaptations from exercise. Please note you have to exercise, and then this is kind of like a small additive. Regarding bone, we're only seeing evidence. There's only about 12 studies published to date, so we definitely need a lot more. But maybe the bone matrix requires a bit more creatine to get some beneficial effects. And again, compared to placebo, we don't see any adverse effects. It seems to be the safest, most effective overall dietary compound because it's probably naturally produced that the human can consider. So I like to say it's just the icing on the cake. You got to have the cake there, and this is just the icing on top, okay? So please note, this metabolite is not going to save the day. You still have to put the work in and do the exercise. So going back to the question, have we discovered the elusive fountain of youth with creatine? One of my favorite bands, U2, no, not even close. We still have to search and keep going. It's in its infancy. It has promise, but there's many things, obviously, we don't know. And I love this quote by Jack. He's one of the pioneers. Exercise and nutrition come together to form a kingdom. If you had to choose one, exercise, and it just came out in a meta-analysis today, it even trumps nutrition from overall health. If you don't exercise, please start. If you do, keep going. Anything that's anti-aging, I would put all my money on exercise. I want to thank you for your time. If there's any questions physically or for those on Zoom, if you want to email me or direct message me, I'd be more than happy. Perfect.